April 30th, 1945, Berlin. The ground trembles beneath iron treads as columns of Soviet T-34 seconds roll through the shattered boulevards of the Reichstag. In the smoke and ruin, the war in Europe breathes its last. But 3,000 miles to the west, in the sprawling tank depots of Aberdeen, Maryland, another sound echoes through the foggy dawn, the methodical clanking of M4 Sherman tanks, row after row, stretching beyond sight, their engines idle, their guns point nowhere. The men who commanded them are already boarding ships for home, and the question hangs in the cold spring air like diesel exhaust. What do you do with 10,000 dragons when the war is over? The Sherman tank was never supposed to be a legend. It was supposed to be good enough. Designed in haste in 1941 as America scrambled to rearm, the M4 was a compromise of speed, production, and practicality. Its armor was thinner than a tiger's. Its gun, by 1944, struggled against the sloped plates of a Panther. Yet it won the war not through superiority, but through sheer, relentless, unstoppable mass. 50,000 Shermans rolled off American assembly lines during the war. 50,000, more than all German tank production combined. They flooded Normandy, churned through the Ardennes, splashed across the Rhine. They were democracy on treads, imperfect, reliable, and infinite. But victory has a peculiar cruelty. It renders its instruments obsolete. By the summer of 1945, the Sherman was already a relic. The war it had been built for was over. The enemy it had been designed to face was vanquished. In the Pentagon, in the War Department, in the sprawling bureaucracies of demobilization, men in pressed uniforms stared at balance sheets and asked the most American of questions. What do we do with all this steel? Some were scrapped. Thousands were. In the months following VE Day, across Europe and the Pacific, Shermans were driven into shallow graves, literally. Entire tank battalions were bulldozed into pits, covered with earth, forgotten. The cost of shipping them home exceeded their value as surplus. In the Philippines, in France, in the scattered islands of the Pacific, they were buried like the men who had died inside them, a generation of iron, interred. But the Sherman refused to die, because while America was done with war, the world was not. In the autumn of 1947, in the orange groves and dusty hills of British Mandate Palestine, a different war was beginning. Jewish paramilitary forces, Haganah, Irgun, Lehi, were preparing for what they knew was coming: the end of British rule, the birth of a state, and the war that would follow. They had rifles, mortars, homemade explosives, but they had no tanks, and in the calculus of modern war, that was a death sentence. The Sherman came to them in pieces, quietly, through shadowy channels. Some were purchased as scrap from European junkyards, their turrets removed, their hulls rusting. Others were smuggled out of American surplus depots, their serial numbers filed away, their manifests falsified. By the spring of 1948, as David Ben-Gurion declared independence and 5 Arab armies crossed the border, the newborn Israeli Defense Forces had managed to assemble a ragtag fleet of 30 Shermans, some missing tracks, some missing guns, all of them patched together with hope and desperation. They called them steel chariots, and they changed everything. At the Battle of Degania, in May 1948, a single Sherman, its crew barely trained, its ammunition nearly exhausted, stopped a column of Syrian armor cold. The psychological impact was seismic. The Arabs had expected a guerrilla war. They had not expected tanks. The Sherman, obsolete by the standards of 1945, was a titan in 1948. And so it fought. At Latrun, at Jenin, at the gates of Jerusalem. The tank that had liberated Europe now midwifed a nation. For Israel, the Sherman became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of survival, of ingenuity, of the refusal to die. And for the next 30 years, through 3 more wars, the Israelis would rebuild, refit, and reimagine the Sherman again and again. They stripped out the old gasoline engines prone to fires, deadly in the desert heat and replaced them with French diesels. They ripped off the 75mm guns and bolted on French 105mm cannons. They welded on additional armor, redesigned the turrets, added modern optics. By the 1967 Six-Day War, the Israeli M51 Super Sherman bore almost no resemblance to the tank that had rolled into Normandy, but it still fought, and it still won. The Sherman had found its second life. Across the globe, in the flooded paddies and jungle corridors of Indochina, another war was unfolding, and once again, the Sherman was there. In 1950, when North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel with columns of Soviet T-34, 85 seconds, the initial American response was chaos. The occupation forces in Japan had been equipped for peacekeeping, not war. Their M24 Chaffee light tanks were outgunned, outmatched, outfought. Desperate, the Pentagon reached into its reserves and pulled out the only thing available, Shermans. Hundreds of them, mothballed in depots across the Pacific, were hastily reactivated and shipped to Korea. They arrived in time for Busan, for Incheon, for the brutal winter retreat from the Chosin Reservoir. And though the Sherman was no longer cutting edge, it was still lethal. Its gun could penetrate a T-34 at close range. Its reliability in the cold and mud exceeded that of many newer designs. And most importantly, it was there, available, ready. The Sherman fought through Korea not as a hero, but as a workhorse, unglamorous, unnoticed, necessary. And when the Korean War ended, the Shermans did not go home. They were handed over to the South Korean Army, to the nascent forces of South Vietnam, to the military aid programs that defined Cold War America. The Sherman became a currency, a diplomatic tool, a gift wrapped in armor plate. In the jungles of Vietnam, Shermans served with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam well into the 1,960 seconds. They were slow, they were loud, they were anachronistic in an age of helicopters and guerrilla warfare. But in the rare conventional engagements at Apbak, at Dong Shuai, they still mattered. Because a tank, even an old one, is still a tank. And in war, presence is power. But the strangest resurrection of the Sherman came not in Israel, not in Korea, not in any conventional theater of war. It came in the mountains and deserts of Latin America, where Cold War proxy conflicts turned forgotten battlefields into stages for obsolete hardware. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israeli Super Shermans faced Syrian T-55 seconds in the volcanic hills of the Golan Heights. The T-55 was a modern tank, the Sherman was not. And yet, in the desperate close-range duels of that war, the Sherman held. Israeli crews trained to perfection, intimate with every idiosyncrasy of their aging machines, fought with a ferocity born of survival, and the Sherman, 3 decades old, still killed. In Central America, in the brush wars of the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds, Shermans appeared again, in the arsenals of Paraguay, of Chile, of Cuba, forgotten, sold, resold, passed from regime to regime like heirlooms of violence. In 1995, 50 years after VE Day, a Sherman was photographed in the Balkans, pressed into service during the Yugoslav wars, rust-streaked, patchwork, still fighting. The Sherman had become a ghost, a phantom of a war that had ended generations ago, wandering battlefields it was never meant to see. There is a photograph, taken in 2003, of an M4 Sherman on display outside a small museum in Normandy. The paint is fresh, the tracks are clean. Tourists pose beside it, smiling. Their children climb on the turret. The tank is harmless now, neutered, a monument. But stand close, and you can still see the scars, a divot in the glacis plate where an 88mm shell struck and failed to penetrate, a weld line where a damaged road wheel was replaced in some forgotten field repair, the faint stenciling on the turret, barely visible beneath layers of paint reading 2nd Armored Division. This tank crossed the Atlantic in 1944. It landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day +3. It fought through Normandy, through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine. It was hit 4 times and never penetrated. Its crew survived the war. And then it was sold as surplus, bought by a Belgian farmer, used to pull ploughs for 30 years, and finally donated to the museum in 1981. 59 years of service. From the hedgerows of France to the wheat fields of Belgium to the quiet gravel lot of a rural museum, the Sherman, like America itself, refused to retire. So what happened to the Sherman tank after World War II? It became a school teacher in the deserts of Israel, a guardian on the frozen hills of Korea, a relic in the jungles of Vietnam, a monument on the village greens of Europe. It became proof that abundance, America's great wartime weapon, does not end with peace, that the machinery of democracy, once built, does not simply vanish. It transforms, it migrates, it adapts. The Sherman was never the best tank, it was never meant to be, but it was there, again and again and again, on every continent, in every conflict, long after its designers were dead, long after the factories that built it were retooled for refrigerators and automobiles. The Sherman endured. Because tools of war do not die when wars end. They find new wars, new hands, new purposes. And in that persistence, in that refusal to fade, the Sherman became something more than a weapon. It became a monument to the strange, haunting permanence of violence, a reminder that history does not end cleanly, that the instruments of liberation can become the instruments of oppression, that abundance, once unleashed, cannot be recalled. Somewhere, today, a Sherman still rusts in a forgotten field, its guns silent, its crew long gone. But the steel remains, waiting, patient, because wars end, but tanks endure.